Okej, vi ska starta det avslutande blocket, and it's time for me to change language. This is the last part of the day, and we are going to present this book, which is the birthday book of Entreprenörskapsforum. It's called 20 Years of Entrepreneurship Research, and it's written by, each chapter is written by one of the Global Award winners. And we have two authors and researchers, professors here to present two chapters in this book. We are going to start with a comparison of women entrepreneurship between Sweden and the United States. So please welcome up on stage Professor from Wake Forest University, Elisabeth Gatewood.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here and have the chance to celebrate the 20th year of the birth of the award for entrepreneurship research. My authors today, co-authors today, were Patricia Green from Babson College and Per Tulin from the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. When I was asked by the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum to write an essay on women's entrepreneurship in Sweden and US with policy implications, I thought about, well, what do we mean by an essay? In the United States, it's a short piece of writing from an author's point of view. So although the essay will use, in my presentation today, will use data collected from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, I am offering my point of view on some policy implications. After multiple visits to Sweden in the last 25 years, I am struck by the many similarities, but also the differences between our two countries. For example, I wish we had more women politicians and high-level government officials in the US. I think our government would work better and function more appropriately around the world. And my impression is at least that you wish you had more entrepreneurs, especially women entrepreneurs in Sweden. That wish is shared by many other countries around the world, which has resulted in the development of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or the GEM project, which is really the most significant research program to date that tracks entrepreneurship rates, motivations, attitudes, and perceptions around the world. In 2012, almost 200,000 individuals from 69 countries, including the US and Sweden, participated in that project. So I'm just going to give you a few definitions that GEM uses, because it'll help later on as I talk about some of the findings. The GEM project surveys not only existing business owners, which they called EBOs, existing business owners, but those in the process of starting businesses, which they term nascents, and those running new businesses up to 42 months old, or new business owners. Together, the new business owners and nascents are called TEAs, or the total entrepreneurial activity. EBA rates are for owners with businesses greater than 42 months. TEA and EBO rates vary widely around the world. As you can see here from this graph, there are considerable variations for the different types of level of economic development. But also there's quite a bit of variation within groups. And in case you're interested, this is the United States here, and there is Sweden right here. So you can see that obviously TEA rates, that is the percentage of the population in early stage entrepreneurial activity, drops as levels of the economy develop over time. There is also considerable variation, although the pattern is somewhat different for established business ownership rates. And again, this is the United States here, and here is Sweden on this graph. The participation of women in entrepreneurship and business ownership also varies widely from country to country. For example, from a 1% rate in Pakistan to a 40% rate in Zambia for TEA or early stage activity, or from 1% in Panama to 36% in Ghana for existing business ownership rates. Rates for women's entrepreneurship track overall entrepreneurial rates. That is, in countries with high rates of entrepreneurship overall, there are high women rates, and if low overall rates, there's low participation for women. However, in almost all countries, the rate of participation in entrepreneurship is lower for women than men. There's only a few countries where they are approximately equal. And again, just to show you on this graph, oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong thing. Okay. Here is the United States. Here you can see there's a difference in men's rates are shown here in the blue, and the red is women's rates. And you can see men's rates in the United States exceed women's rates, and here is Sweden. Again, the story is the same. Men's rates exceed women's rates, but by a considerable more in Sweden than in the United States. Differing rates are thought to be a reflection of different motivations, perceptions, and attitudes, as well as cultural constraints. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, 36 to 37% of those engaged in early stage entrepreneurial activity cited necessity as a motivation for starting a business, versus 73% of women in developed Europe who indicated that the pursuit of opportunity was their motivator. So these are the major impacts on entrepreneurial rates. So we talked about motivation. Also, in every economy, women have lower perceptions of their capabilities to be successful as entrepreneurs than men. But women's perception of their capabilities also varies very widely. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 73% of women thought they had the capabilities to be successful. And that may be a function of the type of business opportunities, which may be simpler at a lower level. But if you look at the percentage of women, for example, in developed Asia, only 16% thought they had the capabilities to be successful. It's also interesting that women have a greater fear of failure than men, and this also shows substantial variation among countries. Women also perceive fewer entrepreneurial opportunities in the environment than men, but again with wide variation. Only 19% of women in developed Asia versus 69% in sub-Saharan Africa saw entrepreneurial opportunities. So it appears that not only the rates of entrepreneurial activity vary widely with economic development levels, but there's significant variation in motivations, perceptions, and attitudes. Now, given that both the Sweden and the US are classified as innovation-driven economies, we would expect to find more similarities than differences between the two countries. But GEM data analysis highlights some differences in rates, motivation, perceptions, and attitudes between the two countries. And using data from 2012 and 2010, my co-authors and I found some interesting differences that we're going to talk about today. So our first finding was that TEA and existing, so total entrepreneurial activity, that early stage activity, and existing business rates, ownership rates, for both men and women are significantly higher in the US than Sweden, and we saw that on the graph. However, one of the interesting things that there's significant higher discontinuation rates, that is, people who stop owning their businesses in the US than in Sweden. And even more interesting, this is because US women have a higher discontinuation rate than Swedish women. There's no significant difference in the discontinuation rate for men in Sweden and the US. A higher percentage of Swedish men and women perceived entrepreneurial opportunities in the environment and consequently cited a pursuit of opportunity for starting a business than US men and women. Interestingly, there was no difference in the percentage of Swedish and US men and women who cited motivation of necessity for their startups. Overall, a smaller percentage of people in, just checking to see I'm on track, smaller percentage of people in Sweden have intentions to start a business, but this is due to a smaller percentage of men. There was no significant difference in the percentage of Swedish and US women with intentions to start a business. And this is despite the fact that Swedish women have a greater fear of failure than US women, and a lower percentage of Swedish women, and by the way also men, perceive that they have the skills to be successful. Overall, a lower percentage of people in Sweden versus the US feel that entrepreneurs are given high status, but this is due to Swedish men holding this view. There is no difference in the viewpoint of women in Sweden and the US regarding the status of entrepreneurs. And finally, a lower percentage of Swedish men and women versus US men and women view entrepreneurship as a good career choice, or think that entrepreneurs are given media attention. Since my special interest and assignment for the essay is women's entrepreneurship, I wanted to focus on the differences between Swedish and US women and some of the general policy implications. So just to summarize, here's a slide that summarizes the difference. Oops, I'm behind on one. Went the wrong way, sorry about that. Women in Sweden reported a higher sense of perceived opportunities than women in the United States, and there is no difference in the percentage of women in the United States and Sweden who intend to start a business, yet the rate of total entrepreneurial activity and established business ownership rates are lower for women in Sweden than in the US. So the question then is, why don't the intentions of women in Sweden translate into actions, and what policies might increase their TEA rates or their total entrepreneurial activity rates and the existing business owner rates? The data tells us that women in Sweden do not perceive that they possess the necessary skills to be successful as entrepreneurs. So one of the policy suggestions might be that you could design educational programs to increase basic business skills, including simple accounting and bookkeeping, marketing, and communications for the startup and early growth phase. As it has been shown that at least for individuals who are encouraged by government policies and programs, entrepreneurial education increases entrepreneurial self-efficacy. And I'm not talking about educational programs that are based on theory, but educational programs that are really based on hands-on experience with a business idea. So entrepreneurial self-efficacy, which is an individual's estimate of her ability to capably perform the roles and tasks to be successful as an entrepreneur, have been shown to be positively associated with entrepreneurial entry rates, and especially in societies like Sweden with a high rate of institutional collectivism. It appears that high self-efficacy insulates individuals from norms that may discourage entrepreneurial behavior. And since self-efficacy is built on earlier success, educational programs need to be designed to provide that hands-on experience to enhance the opportunities for success and to produce that upward spiral of confidence in abilities. One of the interesting findings is that women normally enter entrepreneurial careers later in life, and that's also correlated with increased self-efficacy for women. That the difference between men and women start to decrease as age increases. Women in Sweden also have a greater fear of failure than women in the United States. Fear of failure inhibits entrepreneurial intentions and is negatively associated with entrepreneurial entry and the decision to pursue a business opportunity. Individuals who procrastinate frequently cite fear of failure as one of the causes for delaying action. Fear of failure may lead women in Sweden to never actualize their intentions to start a business. So they may have those intentions and not actually do it because of that fear. So the benefit of designing educational programs with the goal of raising self-efficacy should also increase entrepreneurial behavior as it decreases fear of failure. Individuals who feel confident to face required tasks are less likely to procrastinate. So educational programs should strategically focus on participants' past successes to positively influence a sense of competence. There's also a necessity for designing appropriate educational programs for women in the U.S., but programming there needs to fit their specific cultural and entrepreneurial needs. According to the GEM research, U.S. women don't see opportunities and have a higher discontinuation rate than women in Sweden. So the programming in the United States should concentrate on opportunity recognition and assessment, and also on improving skills for survival in the later growth stage, for example, with problem identification and solution generation. So, showing people the kinds of problems that they might face as they start and grow their business, and what are some of the solutions that people have used to successfully handle those problems. If Sweden desires to raise TEA and EBO rates, additional research is probably needed to understand why Swedish women do not feel that it's a good career choice. Is this a reality? Well, one of the major policy differences between the two countries lies with family policies. In the United States, parental leave policies are very limited and making less differences in the attractiveness between employment and self-employment. However, by the way, I'm not suggesting you change your family policy of leave. I think it's a wonderful thing. But the reality is Sweden's parental leave policy is generous and applies to women and men who own their own business. However, the self-employed might be very reluctant to go on parental leave, since this tends to be damaging to their businesses. And since women tend to use the parental leave system more frequently, this may have an influence on women's interest in entrepreneurship. Other policy differences, for example, sick leave and pensions or social constraints, may make entrepreneurship a less attractive choice in comparison to wage employment, and these may have a greater impact on women. Women in most economies, including developed economies, are still responsible for a greater share of child and elderly care. Entrepreneur attitudes vary across regions and cultures and impact entrepreneurial behavior. In addition to developing educational programs for hard and soft skills, policymakers may need to consider how to raise awareness and change mindsets about entrepreneurship as a career choice. Our analysis showed that compared to the United States, both women and men in Sweden felt that entrepreneurs were afforded less media attention, and men in Sweden felt it was not accorded high status. In order to increase entrepreneurial behavior, it may be necessary to change mindsets about not only its individual value, but what about its collective value to society, since there are many reasons why entrepreneurship has a positive influence on the economy. Only recently have researchers started to investigate and offer theories for differences in entrepreneurship participation rates across regions, countries, and regions within countries. There are two competing theories to explain differences in entrepreneurial behavior with very different policy implications. The first theory, the social legitimation theory or moral approval approach, argues that cultural favorability for entrepreneurship determines higher entrepreneurial activity. And this would imply that increasing entrepreneurial rates centers on changing mindsets to increase social assessment of cultural favorability and acceptance of behavior. The opposing view, the dissatisfaction approach, argues that differences in values and beliefs between potential entrepreneurs and the population as a whole determines entrepreneurial activity. It suggests that entrepreneurial activity is determined by the number of individuals whose values clash with the predominantly non-entrepreneurial culture. This theory would imply that increasing entrepreneurial behavior should focus on identifying cultural outliers, designing educational programs that fit their mindsets, which might mean a different way of communicating and marketing, a different approach to the design of those programs. It may mean also even offering those programs in different locations than what would normally be thought of as being appropriate, and then encouraging them through education and incentives. So more research is needed to identify why intentions of women and men in Sweden do not translate into action, why entrepreneurship is not considered a good career choice, and whether men and women who choose to engage in the entrepreneurial activity are positively influenced by the culture to make that choice or hold beliefs that clash with the predominant culture. More research is also needed to understand why women in the United States don't perceive entrepreneurial opportunities and might have a much higher discontinuation rate than women in Sweden. One of the things I would propose at this time is it may be time to consider different research methodologies. Large sample research projects like GEM or like the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics that was in the United States have provided us the ability to reliably compare across cultures and have a general understanding about the variation in rates, economic levels of development, and the general impact of motivations, perceptions, and attitudes. But it may be time to return to small sample, in-depth research to validate the larger sample research findings and delve more deeply into the questions still to be answered. So not to substitute, but to add a new flavor and to answer some new questions. So thank you again for allowing me to present this and to celebrate with you 20 years of outstanding research and the wonderful prize that you have developed to identify that and to celebrate it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Please stay.
Yes, thank you.
So what you say basically is that Swedish women see opportunities, but
Yes.
we have a greater fear than you as women to fail, and a lower percentage of both men and women in Sweden think that we are skilled to do entrepreneurship. What is wrong with us Swedes?
Well, I'm not sure that it's that much, different than a lot of European countries. And maybe it's significant fear. Obviously, the discontinuation rate in the United States for women is higher, so maybe they enter with greater, belief in their capabilities, but don't do as well. The reality is, I think those are perceptions that can be changed, and so David Storey's shaking his head over there. He doesn't believe in that, so we should have a great debate at dinner tonight. But, I'm a great believer that you can change mindsets and you can influence the way people think about things. And I've seen that in the classroom. I think it makes a difference about the kind of educational programming that we do, but I think the closer it is to the real thing, I think the more impact we can have.
Because obviously it is a cultural and cultural constraint, basically.
Well, it'd be
in your
interesting
head.
to turn around and ask you, why do you think women in Sweden might have a fear
Well,
of
I'm
failure?
one of those entrepreneurs, actually, that,
Okay.
yeah, well, I see opportunities and I rest up from there. I see opportunities and I'm a positivist. But I see the difference, of course.
Okay.
Maybe we can have a discussion on this over dinner, because I would like to invite you to. Do you have questions for Elisabeth? Comments? Yes. We should give you a microphone from somewhere, yes.
I'm a little bit curious about fear of failure. Can bankruptcy laws be one explanation there?
Obviously, there is a difference in bankruptcy ability in the United States, I think. And it may be that, although ours has gotten stiffer over time, more recent, since the Bush administration tightened up some of the possibilities for bankruptcy. It's not as available as it used to be in the United States. I think there might also be a difference in people's viewpoint about what happens after failure in the United States. So, it's interesting that I have conversations. I have a finance colleague, a professor who's a colleague with mine on a research project, and he's always arguing about that entrepreneurs have, they're not perceptive about the risks they're facing. And my argument would be, they understand the risks that they're facing. What they do is they decrease, they don't value, they don't worry about the outcome as much. So they figure that if something bad happens, they can handle the problem at the end. So they will go into a new career or they will start again. So it's not so much the perception of risk in the beginning of the process, it's the way in which they discount the personal risk at the end of the project. So that may be one thing that's different.
And something we can learn from here in Sweden, not least women. Okay, Elisabeth Gatewood, thank you very much for coming. Now moving on to the last speaker of the day, who is going to give us some reflections and confessions on understanding the small business sector. Welcome up on stage, David Storey, Professor of University of Sussex.
Elisabeth, thank you very much. That was plenty to talk about over dinner. First of all, I'm issuing an award to everybody in the room for still being here at 5:20 at night. That is terrific. I'm really pleased you have such resolute determination. I got my award for research 17 years ago. Even Krista Olofsson was wearing short trousers at the time. So it does seem an awfully long time ago. And so I thought, as some sort of preparation for this, I ought to go and have a look about what they said about me 17 years ago. And there were all sorts of very fine phrases, all of which I'm going to ignore. And basically, the panel said two things. They said David Storey's half decent at summarising other people's work. And secondly, for some reason, the policymakers seem to be interested in what he's got to say. And the irony is that summarising other people's work continues to be a prime area of interest of mine. But I'm not sure whether the policymakers continue to take great notice of me. So what does that mean? What it means is that I wrote a book in 1994 called Understanding the Small Business Sector. And in essence, what that book did was it pulled together the work of more than 30 UK researchers at that time, who had worked on this program of research over a 4-year period. And my task was to sort of bring all this lot together. And you write these books of 270 or 370 pages, and actually, there's probably only a couple of sentences which people have ever taken any notice of. One of those says, if you start businesses today, let's assume we have 100 businesses that start today, and you see what happens to those businesses 10 years later. Out of that 100 that start, 40 of them will still be there at the end of the 10-year period. It's actually lower now, but 40. And if you add up the total number of jobs in those 40 businesses that survive, 4 of them will provide you half of your jobs. So in technical speak, the distribution is incredibly skewed. 4% of those that start end up creating you 50% of the jobs. So that starts to have implications for policymakers, because policymakers say, well, can't we park the 96% who aren't important? And I heard, even with my limited knowledge of Swedish, I kept hearing this phrase, picking the winners. And basically, I have always believed that you should look closely at that 4%, because they are disproportionately important. When I've been round the world talking to policymakers, I have the same conversation with ministers in every country. Ministers say to me, how am I going to get this country to be more entrepreneurial? And I say, well, Minister, you've got 2 choices. You can either get more people to start businesses, or you can enable the existing businesses to perform better. That's the choice you've got. And on balance, I prefer doing something about the existing businesses rather than getting large numbers of people to start new businesses. Primarily on the basis that new business starts stimulated by policy tend to be hairdressers, vehicle repairers and window cleaners who come in, knock out the existing hairdressers, vehicle repairers and window cleaners. You get a lot more churn, but not much additional economic activity. So I say to ministers, don't worry about all this business about starting businesses. What you've got to try and do is you've got to try and get more action out of what you've got. And the 4% creating the 50% is interesting because it starts to take you along the lines of picking the winners. Understanding the small business sector. See the little word confessions at the bottom. My confession to you is that I now realize that this identification of businesses which grow rapidly is one hell of a lot harder than ever I thought it was 17 years ago. Doesn't mean to say it's impossible, but it says it's much, much harder than I thought it was. And I'm going to show you a couple, no more than 3 diagrams, I hope, if I can work the machine. And clearly I can't. Okay, yes. As in all aspects of life, the Swedes were there before me. And this is an example of it. What I would like you to do, don't shout out the answer because I suspect there are 1 or 2 people in the room who know the answer. This says, we are looking at fast-growing firms in Sweden. We're going to look at the top 3% of growers across all businesses in Sweden in 1999 to 2002. And let's assume there are 100. There aren't actually, there are 5,700 and something, but I can't do big numbers. So let's deal with 100. You've got to ask yourself, how many of those businesses, of those 100, that were exceptionally fast growing in the 1999 to 2002 period, how many of them made it to the next 3-year period of 2002 to 2005? Don't answer. Pontus, behave yourself. And then you've got to ask yourself, how many of that 100 then make it on to the next 3-year period? Just muse on it. If you believe there was a degree of consistency, you might be saying to yourself, well, probably in the next one along, we've probably got 20, 30 who make it to the next period, continuous growth. You might be saying to yourself, well, in the 3rd period, it might be 5 or 10. There is almost no continuity between businesses that grow rapidly in one period, exceptionally rapidly, and businesses that grow in a next period. Now that has implications for winner picking. But I hear you say to yourself, well, this is only Sweden. Small country, 10 million people, didn't qualify for the World Cup. You know, this is not an important country. What we want to do is we want to look at a really important country. We want to look at a country that's pretty certain to win the World Cup in Brazil in the summertime. England. You were not meant to laugh at that. England. And I'm now going to show you a diagram which, when you see it for the first time, you will recoil in horror. You will say to yourself, I can't face that. That looks horrible. But I'm truly going to make my very best efforts to interpret it for you. So don't all go back like that. Just stay with me, because I'm going to persuade you that it is the most beautiful and knowledgeable diagram you ever need to know about small businesses. Okay, we ready for it? That's it. Now let me talk you through this diagram. On this axis along here, we show the growth rates or decline rates of new businesses in their second year of life. So, the gazelles are the ones who are growing at 300, 300, 400, 500. I need a Hans Rosling diagram, you know, and I need a big stick here for really to show you this. But, so these are the ones who grow incredibly rapidly in their second year of life. And then what we do on this axis here is we show whether you increase or decrease in your third year of life. So the ones up here are the ones who grow very rapidly in their third year of life, and down here are the ones who decline rapidly in their third year of life. First thing to see is that if you look at all the ones that grow in both years, all the ones in this quadrant here, they constitute 32% of surviving new businesses in England. Would anyone do me a favour and put out their hand if they regularly look at business plans for new ventures? Fantastic. 1/3 of new businesses which survive for 3 years grow in year 2 and year 3, which means that 2/3 have either 2 years of decline or 1 year of decline. Would you say that 1/3 of businesses who submit a business plan identify any form of decline in their sales? By the way, there were 2 embarrassed shakes of the head further down. So what people tell you and what actually happens, these are sales, are very, very different. So the first thing to say is the typical business has which gets to year 3 has at least 1 year of decline in their sales. Second thing is returning to picking the winners. Let's assume that the minister comes to Pontus and he says, Pontus, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to identify, by the time we get to in year 2, I'd like you to tell me how many, about the businesses that are likely to increase very substantially in year 3. So what I'm interested in is I'm interested in this group of businesses, let's say here. They've grown, in year 3, they're going to grow by, let's say, 3.5 times. That's a real gazelle, isn't it, Magnus? 3.5 times growth is pretty good. Okay? Got that? Well, actually, if we look across, we can see that there were actually more firms that declined in year 2, but which grew by 375% in year 3, than there were ones that grew in that quadrant. If it were nice and well behaved, the thing would just go nice and up and down there. It doesn't. Absolutely doesn't. So what does that mean? It means, perhaps, one thing for my academic colleagues: volatility. In other words, these firms shift about incredibly in terms of their sales. Now, what most of my academic colleagues try and persuade you about is, going back to looking at this, they will say, well, of course, it's to do with their prior business experience of the entrepreneur. Well, it can't be, because in one period of time they're growing fantastically, the next period of time they're declining radically. Ah, well, they say it's to do with the opportunity recognition. So these boys and girls are recognizing the opportunity like crazy in some years, and suddenly their vision of opportunity disappears the year after. Can't be gender, unless a lot of them are having the operation between 1 year and another. So, what is it? It isn't the traditional academic descriptions, because if you're going to have an explanation of why it is that you grow in 1 year, you've got to have an explanation of why it is that you decline the next year. And it's not just the British ones. Remember, get exactly the same things with the Swedish data. So there's a challenge for my academic colleagues. You've got to tell me why it is not only that you increase what I call the one-way bet, you've got to persuade me as well that you've got a reason why you decline 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years later. It's got to be the same explanation. So what does it mean for the policymakers? Well, it says picking winners is hard. But you've got to say to yourself, even though it's hard, is it still the best option in town? In other words, is it better than something else? And the answer is, I think it is better than existing what I would call firm-based policies. Firm-based policies are policies that say, I'm going to support technology businesses. I'm going to support businesses with growth potential. I'm going to support businesses established by the unemployed. I'm not in favor, I'm decreasingly in favor of that. What, however, I do think is important, and again, I've sort of picked this up in the discussion, the big environment, the macro environment in which these businesses operate, really, I think, is much more important. So to return to the question I get posed by the minister, which says, how am I going to get this country to be more entrepreneurial? The answer, I think, is to say to them, look at the big macro policies, obviously the traditional macro policies, but also issues such as the regulation, the taxation, the immigration, the whole area of competition within the economy. These seem to me the preconditions for making that economy more entrepreneurial. It's the big picture, rather than operating at the individual firm level. How many minutes was it, Mia?
A bit over 17.5.
17,
okay, David.
I promised her
Thank you very
17.5.
much. Thank you very much. So basically what you're saying is firm-based policies, no good, picking winners a little bit better, but best of all, big macro policy things. Okay, questions for David? Yes, Pontus.
Notice I stand behind here when you're asking the questions.
Thank you, David, for a very nice presentation. It seems to me as if you have changed your mind and perhaps your interest somewhat, so that you were much keener on the possibilities to pick the winners before.
That's the confessions.
That's the confession. And then you referred to soccer here, I believe, and I normally, when I hear you, you always refer to cricket, so that's another development, I would say. And both of them, in my view, are quite positive. When we look at the 3-year development of these firms here, what about the time span here, 3 years? I guess some of these firms will be very small, and then you have these huge percentage-wise changes. What if you take a 10-year perspective? Would it be more like you grow, you flatten out, you perhaps decrease a bit, and then you grow again, and you have this sort of staircase structure, or how would it look? Have you done anything on that?
Well, again, the Swedish data, Per Davidsson and his pals did some work on looking at gazelles in Sweden. And one of the things that he found, which I think is very interesting, is that the single biggest group of gazelles were what he called one-shots. In other words, these were businesses which grew rapidly 1 year and never grew before and never grew afterwards. So this notion of maybe we could spread it out over a few years. I mean, what I strongly suspect, and the work we've also done in the UK, suggests that most of these gazelles return to the industry average after another period of time. So that again, if you were looking, let's say 10 years on, you would find almost none of the firms that were a gazelle 10 years previously being a gazelle today. That's the central problem. The issue is the 4% create 50% is still there. It's just a different 4%.
So basically, picking the winners and pointing out the gazelles is pretty pointless.
Well, you have to ask yourself as to what's the best option in town. I mean, pretty useless, but then what's even worse, in my judgment, is getting large numbers of people to start businesses, entering the easy-to-enter industries, and knocking out the existing people who are in those, so you get the whole economy whizzing round much faster, but you don't get any more economic activity. And yet that is often viewed as the core of entrepreneurship, getting people to start businesses.
But your best advice is get back to big macro policies.
Now, the nature of the... Oh, Elisabeth, can I have a go at this point? The really interesting thing, to go back to
David, very quick.
The big macro policy. What Elisabeth said was, for Sweden, she said, well, of course, we're not suggesting, if you want to get more female entrepreneurs in Sweden, that you should actually make life more difficult for females. Well, why not? If you actually want to increase the number of female entrepreneurs, why not make life more difficult less family friendly for females working in the public sector? And actually, the explanation of, let's look now at Sweden, there's more fear of failure. Swedish women may be just much more realistic about exactly what the risks are. So we've got to be a little bit careful about it. Always remember, in my judgment, these big macro policies are the things that drive it.
David Storey, thank you very much for coming.